Thank you very much, James. Ambassador Ruth Adler, James, Chair of Australian History at UCD, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, and students. It's a great privilege for me to be here tonight, to be talking at the Irish Academy on this only my third visit to the land of my ancestors, and it's a thrill to be here. My task tonight, to interpret Australia to Ireland, seems somewhat superfluous or forlorn. Superfluous because the Australians and the Irish invariably get on well together when they meet and seem to have very little need to explain themselves to one another. And forlorn, perhaps because the stereotypes we have of one another have served us so well to this point that they may not warrant disturbance. So perhaps it's the Irish in me that compels me to the task tonight. The Australian people today can be said to embody three great traditions: British, Irish and multicultural. The first two came with our European existence post-1788, and the third began from the 1960s. In our 2011 census, 2.1 million Australians out of 23 million said they had Irish ancestry. Despite this shared heritage, however, the Australian and the Irish experiences are distinctly different. Ireland has an ancient heritage, while Australia is a New World society. Ireland fought for its independence, while Australia had its nationhood gifted by Britain. Ireland is a proud republic, while Australia remains a constitutional monarchy. Indeed, our Queen is far distant from us and very close to you. Ireland is a neutral nation, while Australia has enjoyed a 60-year close alliance with the United States and has an allied consciousness. While there is a revolutionary tradition in Irish politics, Australia's political traditions tend to be conservative and social democratic. Ireland realises its modern destiny within the European Union, while Australia's destiny is that of a standalone nation-state without the comfort of a regional economic or political union now or in the future. Ireland is located adjacent to Britain, while Australia is in the South Pacific, is in an Asian and Islamic geography next to Indonesia, the largest Muslim nation. These are significant differences and points of separation, sufficient to ensure, I think, that we should remain curious about each other. Geography is the key to the Australian mind and the Australian psyche. Geography dictated that Australia was the last continent to be occupied by Europeans, who interrupted 60,000 or more years of unbroken Aboriginal society. For many of the Europeans who came to Australia in the late 18th and 19th centuries, the journey they made was their last. Their departure from the old world was, for many, the irrevocable event. Among the first Irish arrivals were 155 convicts from County Cork who landed in Sydney in 1791. Thousands of people came to Australia in servitude and were later freed. So from the inception, there were two views of Australia. It was the end of the earth, a place of despair and desolation, or alternatively, the beach and the rolling plains that offered a new life. When the Australian colonies federated in 1901, our nationhood was tied to geography. The cry became a nation for a continent and a continent for a nation. The Australian mind was shaped by water, bush, distance and desert. Our identity is not rooted in politics. Politics is important. Australia is a dedicated, compulsory voting democracy, but political ideology did not form the national character. The nationalism of most nations is forged by wars of independence or revolution, but not Australia. It was too lucky. It became a nation by a vote of all the people without a shot being fired. It has never been enslaved by a glorious or tragic past or an all-consuming national myth. Indeed, for too long, Australia has been cavalier about its own history. The European history of Australia, virtually the entire European history of Australia, comes after the American and French revolutions and after the inception of the Industrial Revolution in Britain. One of the consequences is that democracy took root in our soil as fast and as deep as any place on earth. There was no inherited aristocratic class. Australians quickly assumed the rights of man, the rule of law, the Christian faith, and a place in the sun, though their Irish skin led to that being somewhat discomfortable. In this society, mateship and egalitarianism ran deep. The idea that one man is as good as another, matched by an instinctive lack of respect, often contempt for authority, a legacy of the convict days. The British and Irish cultures were transported to Australia, but they were modified and adapted, and over time fashioned into a new Australian culture. From the colonial age, Australia was bequeathed a single good fortune. Its vast continent was only settled through the British Empire. Neither the French, nor the Dutch, nor any other European power claimed any of Australia's vast territory. So our history in that sense is different to that of Canada or South Africa. British institutions, laws and customs prevailed from Sydney to Perth in remarkable continental unity. During the second half of the 19th century, living standards in Australia began to surpass those of Britain, based upon expanded agriculture and primary produce, but above all on a phenomenal series of gold rushes. At Federation in 1901, most Australians worked by hand and most lived outside the capital cities. The stereotypical male was a meat eater with bad teeth, good lungs, and healthy self-reliance. The quest for wage justice in the 1890s depression led to a very strong trade union movement and the election in Queensland of the first Labor government anywhere in the world. The Irish working class influence was powerful. Australia's party system, fashioned in the early 20th century, was defined by class. It was Labor versus Liberal, but Labor was heavily Catholic and Irish, and Liberal heavily Protestant and British. When the Constitution was written in the 1890s, our founding fathers had two inspirations, Britain and America. They took the Westminster system from Britain and their federal system and their Senate from the United States. From the foundation in 1901, Australia, a nation of less than 4 million people, could not defend itself, despite a system of limited national service. Its leaders looked in three directions. They always have and they always will. They looked to Europe and Britain. Britain, the source of empire, the source of finance and security, home of the British fleet, the final guarantor of Australian security. They looked to the north, to Asia, and above all, at that time, they looked to a rising Japan, seen as a military and racial threat, a threat realised in World War II with Japan's conquest of Southeast Asia, its bombing of Darwin, our most northern city, with 250 civilians being killed, and intense and bitter fighting between Australian and Japanese troops in Papua New Guinea during the war. And finally, Australians, of course, looked east. They looked across the Pacific to the United States. In 1908, what was reported to be the largest crowd in Sydney's history to that stage lined the foreshores to witness the 16 battleships of President Teddy Roosevelt's Great White Fleet advance into the harbour. Prime Minister Alfred Deakin wrote on that occasion that Australians were already looking to America, quote, because of the distrust of the yellow race in the North Pacific, unquote. At nationhood, Australia had a dual identity. We were Australian, but we were British. Our early Prime Ministers were Australian nationalists and they were Empire loyalists. The two went together. They had to go together for survival. The finest of our early Prime Ministers, Alfred Deakin, called himself an independent Australian Briton. That made sense for a long time. Obviously, it's now extinct. Now, I hope by this stage of the lecture I've given you sufficient impressions to outline what I see as the two great conflicting ideas in Australian history, embedded from the start and still with us today. The first idea, conceived in some ambition, was that Australia had to become a better Britain, more prosperous, more democratic, and that the means of achieving this lay in the purity of separation. Australia would become a sanctuary for the white race, for the working man, for New World democracy, its young manufacturing industry protected by high tariffs. The idea was that Australian uniqueness lay in its continental isolation, its oceanic separation from the world. Purity in isolation was the concept. But right from the start, there was a competing idea, the belief that Australia had to be joined to the world as a participant and stakeholder to survive and prosper. The argument ran that a supreme effort was needed to counter a remote geography, to counter such a remote existence. That Australia had to put a premium on trade with the world, foreign investment, defence cooperation, sticking with Britain because Britain was a ticket to influence, but seeking to build wider partnerships and coalition of interest to fulfil its potential. Our intense involvement in 2 world wars testified to the idea of joining the world to further our own interests and further our own survival. World War I bequeathed a truly strange and bizarre irony. Australia's most sacred site lies not on our own continent, but on a peninsula in Turkey, 7,000 miles from home, the location of the landing by Australian and New Zealand forces in April 1915. Now, the struggle between these two national visions, purity in isolation on the one hand and engagement with the world on the other, leads to the enduring question, what is Australia's real purpose? Is it doomed forever as a museum to a truly bizarre accident, Europeans shipwrecked on the wrong side of Earth? Or does Australia have a higher purpose for its people and the world? For me, the answer to this question lies in the transformation of Australia over the past 50 years, and in particular, over the past 30 years. The answer to the question, in short, is that Australia decided it could both engage fully with the world, yet keep its uniqueness. These ideas, over time, have ceased to be in conflict, and they became reconciled. This is the key to modern Australia. The foundations of our contemporary society rest, I've argued, in 4 fundamental transformations over the last several decades. And those transformations relate to people, economy, national strategy, and identity. And they are the focus of the second part of the lecture I'm giving tonight. The most important of all these transformations concerns people. Our former Prime Minister Bob Hawke once told me he believed the decision after World War II that Australia should become a country of mass immigration was the most important single decision taken by Australia's leaders in the past century. I agree with him. Australia's population is now 23 million. It's taken nearly 8 million people through an immigration program since World War II based on a settler philosophy of becoming Australian citizens and contributing to national economic development. The population has increased 6-fold since Federation. In Australia today, 25% of the population were born abroad. The comparable figure for the United States is 11%. New diaspora communities are forming: Chinese, Korean, Indian, Vietnamese, alongside the vast and sprawling Italian and Greek communities from earlier decades. In literal terms, Australia is a multicultural society with people from more than 140 nations coming to our country. Our philosophy of multiculturalism, however, puts a premium on respect for Australian values and laws. There is a distinct Australian approach to immigration policy. It is based upon firm border controls, regulated and legal entry based on defined criteria, a migrant intake geared to labour market needs and therefore in the national economic interest, and strong opposition to illegal immigration. Australia has been relatively successful integrating large migrant populations into its society, though this is now being tested to a certain extent with some of the new Muslim communities. The contentious hard line adopted by both sides of Australian politics to asylum seeker boat arrivals can only be understood in terms of the controlled and large-scale immigration intake that I've outlined. Australia's annual population increase is far in advance of the European norm. This reflects two bedrock realities: a powerful developmental ethos in a nation with responsibility for an entire continent, and an awareness that in a globalised world it's not tenable for a country like Australia to put up a house full sign. The second area that defines modern Australia has been the era of pro-market economic reform that began with the Hawke Government in 1983 and continued for a bit more than 20 years. These economic reforms are pivotal to Australia's history and its prosperity. In essence, they meant transforming Australia from a protected to an open economy that had to live on its own competitive performance. Tariffs were scaled back, the financial system was deregulated, economic integration with Asia was enhanced, productivity improved, and Australia's growth rate lifted significantly compared with other developed nations. Australia has now enjoyed 22 years of unbroken economic growth without recession. I believe this is unmatched by any other developed country. For Australia, the 2008 global financial crisis was an external event. Our four major banks were sound, government debt had been eliminated by the Howard government. This meant the new Labor government of Kevin Rudd, in a position of financial strength, was able to engage in a major fiscal stimulus without creating too much of a debt or budget deficit problem. In short, Australia, like Canada, has had a distinctly different experience in the global financial crisis to most Western nations, notably the United States and the European Union. There are, however, now signs of serious economic challenges ahead. Economic growth, which has averaged over 3% for most of the last 20 years, is now down at 2.5% and slowing. Unemployment is around 6.5% and rising. Australia's government debt continues to grow while still low in OECD terms. The real debate in Australia in recent years, though many people won't admit it, has been about the management of prosperity. This has been propelled by a phenomenal resources boom, easily the biggest in 150 years. The boom has been in coal, iron ore and LNG. Starting in 2003, it's been an epic event that saw our terms of trade, export prices relative to import prices, running at 80% higher than the 100-year trend line. The annual boost to national income has been around 12 to 15% of GDP. In the years running up to 2013, average incomes in Australia reach levels significantly above those of either the United States or the European Union. This story is driven very much by China. Australia is an economic partner in China's industrialisation and modernisation. Its prosperity is now more dependent on China than probably any other Western nation. In terms of individual nations, China has become our major trading partner, replacing Japan, that had previously become our major trading partner in the 1960s during its own post-war industrialisation. To visit the great mining and energy projects in Queensland and Western Australia and offshore on the Northwest Shelf is a remarkable experience. Mining and energy is Australia's state-of-the-art industry, with the world's biggest mining company, BHP Billiton, originally founded at Broken Hill in New South Wales. The great challenge for Australia now is the transition of its economy from fantastic commodity prices to relatively high commodity prices. This means rebalancing the economy back towards the non-resources sector. It's a daunting task with at least a threat of recession. This story, however, again highlights our different economic experience to much of the rest of the West. Australia, despite its modest population, is now the 13th largest economy in the world and sits as a member of the G20 group of nations. Though I think it's fair to say we won't get higher than number 13 as a result of the rise of a number of emerging economies, which will ensure, as we go into the future, that Australia will be pushed down the league tables. The third area of redefinition I want to look at tonight is national strategy and foreign policy. The ultimate sign of national maturity is accepting responsibility for one's fate in the world. You don't have to do that as part of a large empire, but when the empire goes, that is an inevitable responsibility. Australia has done this most notably in our sustained engagement with Asia over the past half-century. Engagement with Asia is not an option. It is an enduring national project for Australia, which goes to social, economic and immigration policy. It's a whole of government challenge. And it's not just a challenge for government, it's a challenge for the entire community. There are probably similarities with Ireland's commitment to the European project. Australia lives in an Asian geography. This is a great opportunity for us, since global economic power is shifting decisively to East Asia. But it's also a challenge, because Asia is the site of rapid military modernisation in a region where deep antagonisms remain and security arrangements remain embryonic at best. I suggest the 5 most important bilateral relationships for Australia these days are with the United States, China, Indonesia, Japan and India, 4 of the 5 being in Asia. Australia engages with Asia as a committed United States alliance partner. That's how we go to the region, and that won't change. We have fought every major war with the United States for a century. World War I, World War II, Korea, Vietnam, the First Gulf War, and the recent wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. The United States alliance remains part of the fabric of our existence. In net terms, this has been a plus for us in Asia. But Australia now faces a strategic challenge without precedent in its history. For the first time, our major trading partner, China, is not a strategic ally. For much of our history, Britain was our major trade and security partner. Then the United States replaced Britain as the main strategic partner. Then Japan, an American ally, became our major trading partner. Now the world has changed. We are heavily locked in to China, heavily dependent upon China. And China and America are in turn locked into a pattern of oscillating competition and interdependence. Australia, like the rest of Asia, sits between China and the United States. The central test of our strategic policy is to reconcile these two relationships and to ensure that we never have to choose between them, though of course that depends on future relations between Beijing and Washington. We need both. We need China for our national income and to validate successful engagement with Asia. We need America as our principal ally and close partner in defence, security and intelligence, and our most successful investment partner as well. The final element of redefinition, and the most elusive, goes to identity. When that great political scientist Sam Huntington wrote his book, The Clash of Civilizations, arguing before 9/11 that civilizations, not ideologies, would determine future conflict, he identified a small group of countries that he called torn countries: Turkey, Mexico and Australia. And Huntington said in relation to Australia that under Paul Keating's leadership, Australia had decided to defect from the West, become a republic, cease being a branch office of empire, and redefine itself as an Asian society. Well, Sam got that one wrong. In actual fact, Paul Keating had said in 1996, and I quote, "We can't be Asian any more than we can be European or North American or African. We can only be Australians and relate to our neighbours as Australians," unquote. This was a recognition of Australia's uniqueness and a recognition that the age of independent Australian Britons had long gone. Intellectuals continue to fight and debate Australian identity, but there's little fight in the Australian community or among the Australian people for this. The people, as John Howard realised, seem relaxed and very unconfused about their identity. Australians are pragmatists. They are very alert to false choices. They like taking the best that's on offer. They prize their British heritage, their Irish spirit, their multicultural society, their engagement with Asia, and their links to the United States. And they don't see any reason why they can't have the lot, the whole lot. They know greater efforts are required in the unfinished business of improving the lot of the Aboriginal people and reconciliation between contemporary Australians and the first Australians. This is a major task still facing the community. The monarchy versus republican debate is hardly mentioned these days. It will return sometime, but it's a low priority at present. It's noteworthy that in the past 6 years of Labor government, the issue was not put on the table or given any priority at all, following the defeat of the referendum on the Republic in 1999. The country's current medium-term challenges and preoccupations relate very much to economic policy. While the Labor government of Rudd, Gillard and then Rudd again maintained a growth economy, Australia's competitiveness and its productivity is in trouble. We have become complacent in prosperity. We, to a certain extent, have lost the political art of economic reform. The reform arteries are hardening. With the transition away from the resources boom, Australia faces either an actual fall in living standards at worst, or a significant decline in the rate of growth of living standards at best. The public is not ready for this adjustment. They're not ready for this event. John Howard's protege, Tony Abbott, has recently been elected Prime Minister after 6 years of Labor rule. But Abbott now faces a very difficult environment. The economic challenge is serious. He doesn't control the upper house, the Senate. Our politics has become highly polarised. In terms of assessing Abbott, there are 3 points I would make about the influences on him as Prime Minister. The first is that Howard is a very conventional Liberal Party Prime Minister, and the person who has influenced him most in political and personal terms is John Howard. Howard is a very close friend of Abbott and has a deep affection for him. Abbott served as a minister and then as a cabinet minister in the Howard cabinets. He was Minister for Employment, Industrial Relations and Health at various stages. So in that sense, Abbott is not a new or strange commodity. He's a commodity which has been fashioned through the Howard government, very influenced by the Howard government. And as I said, in that sense, I think he'll be a conventional Liberal Party Prime Minister. The second great influence on Abbott is that the recent Labor government, the Rudd-Gillard-Rudd government, is the anti-model. This was a government chronically divided at leadership level, a government accused of being dysfunctional by its own senior ministers, a government that was unable to get its priorities right and was undermined by repeatedly breaking election commitments. Abbott has drawn upon the Labor experience and fashioned an approach to government in which Labor, as I said, is the anti-model. Abbott puts a priority on proper cabinet decision-making, on establishing a clear sense of policy priority, of ensuring that he honours his election commitments, doesn't introduce policies for which he doesn't have a mandate. Abbott, in this sense, has devised a two-term election strategy. He was elected on a modest mandate at the September election. He'll put in place a number of inquiries and investigations, and he'll go to his re-election in 2016 with a more ambitious reform agenda. And the third significant influence on Abbott is the business community. Abbott has declared on election night that Australia is open for business again. He's very influenced by the fact that the Labor government was fractured to a considerable extent because of the collapse in relations between the government and the business community. Unlike the previous Labor government of Hawke and Keating, which worked effectively with the business community, Rudd and Gillard lost the confidence of the corporate sector. Abbott is determined to regain that confidence and puts a high premium on introducing a series of policies to underpin investment confidence. The key to Australia's success over the past generation, above all, since the advent of the Hawke government in 1983, has been quality decision-making at the political level. I've argued that I think the Hawke government is one of the most successful governments in Australian history. But in recent years, we've lost this art. And unless it's rediscovered, then I think things will get tough in Arcadia. Thank you very much.